So we're going to begin, and David is going to lead us in prayer.
Let's pray again. Father, we thank you for Alyssa's hard work. And we see the fruits of it as she shares with us her studies about slavery and the after effects of slavery. And today we pray especially for the churches of our nation to awaken to the ways in which we have contributed to the horrendous injustice done to black people and other minorities. Speak to us words of grace and words of hope. In Christ's name.
Thank you. So as always, we're going to start with the 3 goals that we have for this entire session, which is an emotional goal to be able to talk safely about the emotional challenges, because this is a very difficult topic for many people. We have the historical goal of being able to examine how and why the white church helped maintain slavery in the U.S., and we're doing that by looking at Kentucky, wasn't just Kentucky, of course. And then we have a theological goal, because as David prayed, we need to think about how we as the body of Christ can be more like Jesus because of what we're learning today and as we continue to learn. Through each one of our sessions, we also have a separate goal for that day. So today we're going to be looking at the historical content of Is Slavery a Sin? And what I'm challenging all of us to think about is think about ways that people use the scriptures to exclude others, however we define others at any given time, and justify doing so. Last week we looked at how slavery moved into Kentucky when they decided to make Kentucky a state. They didn't just go, oh, well, let's create slavery. No, slavery already existed and moved into Kentucky. And as I was working on that chapter in my thesis, I started thinking about, I wonder how the whole idea of slavery, particularly being okay in the church, came about. So the content that we're going over today was not in my original thesis proposal. It was something I decided to do as I was working on the material. This particular graphic is very misleading because it makes it look like we have a well laid out road and it's going to be easy to get to the points, when in fact I should have had a slide of people in their safari outfits and us bushwhacking through, because this is going to be very dense material that I'm trying to present and that you're going to be trying to follow along with today. So I hope we all get there safely. We're going to be looking at 3 separate areas of thought. First, that just the idea of who should be a slave. Then we're going to move into some connections between being an evangelical and slavery. And then we're going to end up looking at the pro-slavery defense from the Bible. How people who were pro-slavery did then and still today use the Bible to make that case. So we're going to begin with the thought of slavery based on nationality. So one country conquers another country and those people become the slaves. And we'll just start with Aristotle and the famous philosopher and intellect, that Western culture was so influenced by him. And he taught that some, meaning the Greeks, because conveniently he was Greek, some were born to natural rule, and others, meaning the non-Greeks, or what he called the barbarians, were marked for natural subjugation. So some people were born to be rulers and some people were born to be slaves. And convenient for him that he was a Greek. Now the Greeks, of course, well known for their architecture, for art, for literature, again, just ways of thought, how they're influencing life today, the Olympics. But all of that was possible because they were a slave system. They had other people doing the work, which freed them up to do the thought and to create and to have the beauty that lasts today. So whenever we think about the Greeks, we talk about the benefits, but we also want to remember they had the benefits because they were a slave system. And Aristotle himself, talked about it wasn't just friendly slavery, it was a true slave system. Another slave system was the Roman Empire. And this is what we would call a dog tag, except it was attached to a human being. They had a collar around their neck, the enslaved person, and this tag on it said, "Hold me lest I flee, and return me to my master Vinicius on the estate of Callistus." So just like you would have a lost dog with a tag, the enslaved people had a tag so that they knew where to return them because they were property. Historian Jennifer Glancy says, slaveholders in the first century characterized their slaves as bodies. They weren't people, they were bodies. And they were treated commensurate with this. And here are just some things that points that she makes about slavery in the Roman world. And think about how this matches up to what we learned about slavery last week. A male slave had no legal connection to his own offspring, excluding him from the status of being a father. Slaveholders had unrestricted access in all ways to their slaves, male, female, and children. Female slaves were valued for reproduction and lactation, being wet nurses. Anyone acquiring a female slave would own her offspring. The bodies of slaves were vulnerable to verbal and physical attacks of abuse from any freeborn citizen, unless they had the protection of their owners. And free women in the ancient world who could afford wet nurses, enslaved wet nurses, relied on them. But those women, after they had done their job, they could still be sold, to repay debts or in an estate settlement. I could go on at length about the Roman Empire and some of the different levels of status in the Roman Empire, but the point here is that this was still slavery based on nationality. Nations were conquered, and those conquered nations were the ones that became slaves. Around the 6th century, this began to change, and it was fully changed by the time we get to the 15th century, when we have Pope Nicholas V. Now, he was issuing these papal bulls, these edicts from his position as Pope, that gave countries and explorers the right to conquer any non-westernized land that they came to, the right to conquer them based on the idea that he was the representative of God, he is the Pope, and so he was giving them the right to conquer. So now, instead of slavery based on nationality, we have slavery based on religion. If you are not a Christian nation, you can be enslaved. And I, as the Pope, am telling you that this is correct. So his first edict in 1452 was known as Dum Diversis. I hope I'm saying that right. And it granted permission to, quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Muslims and pagans whatsoever. Pretty strong language, isn't it? And then after taking goods from all the people, permission was granted by the Pope to King Alfonso V of Portugal and all of the king's heirs, that they can, quote, reduce their persons that they've conquered to perpetual slavery and to convert them to his and their use for profit. So the Pope's giving to the king and all the king's heirs the right to own all of the people that they conquered and all of their heirs into perpetuity forever with this one edict. Now this edict was combined with 4 others, additional papal bulls, and all of them together are known as the doctrine of discovery. One of these papal bulls specifically mentions Christopher Columbus and gives him permission to conquer, in all the ways that we've read about, any lands, any peoples that he happened upon when he was out exploring. And it says, venture forth, quote, that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to faith itself, end quote. So this is one of the first times when we see permission to destroy people, to take them in captivity, to turn them into subjects, because we are evangelizing them. This is good for them and their faith that we're doing these horrible things to them. And so that was in one of these papal bulls that is part of this doctrine of discovery.
They're saving their soul.
We're saving their souls.
And taking their land also.
And taking their land, making slaves out of them. But because they're not Christian, this is good for them that we're doing this. So we see this as early as the 1400s, this being codified in European documents. The English, of course that was Catholic coming out of Rome. The English were a little late to this party, but they decided this was a good idea, and so they eventually caught up to it. So in 1629, John Winthrop, who was a lawyer and a Puritan, he's a dissenter against the Church of England, that's what the Pilgrims were. He was listing reasons why the Puritans ought to immigrate to the New World and take it over in the name of the Church of England. And someone objected to his being able to enter a land that other people already existed. And he said, that which lies common and hath never been replenished or subdued. So we've got this land who's not European, they're not Christian, is free to any that will possess and improve it. For God hath given to the sons of men, meaning the white men, the white European men, God has given to the white men a double right to the earth. There is a natural right, Aristotle, you hear that Aristotle in there. There's a natural right and a civil right. So he's essentially making the same argument only on behalf of the Church of England, that God has given us the right to go into these lands and to take them over and to enslave those people. Then we have Barbados. So Barbados, the Caribbean island of Barbados, was Britain's first black slave society and the most systemically violent, brutal, and racially inhumane society of modernity. So the English turned Barbados into this plantation economy that relied entirely on slave labor, and they were brutal. I can't even describe to you. It was We do not care if people will die, the black people, because we will just replace them. It was driving them as hard, worse than you would drive an animal, because it didn't matter. They aren't really people, and we will just replace them. So in 1640s in Barbados, and one of the authors, Catherine Grubner, has the documents where she tracked this, showing that in 1640s, the word Christian was used to mean someone who held a specific doctrine or belief, usually white people. Then in the 1660s, Christian became a word that was associated with those who were not slaves. So not just a belief, but now it was people who were not slaves. Well, as that use came into being, some of the black people, either because they genuinely had a belief or maybe they saw a way out, began to convert to Christianity. Well, this created a dilemma, didn't it, for the white slave owners? Because if being Christian meant non-slave and a black person becomes a Christian, then does that mean they are now not a slave? So then through the writings, Grubner was able to track how by 1700 the word Christian became associated with being white. Very openly and clearly, to be a Christian was to be white. So you could have black Christians, but that did not change their slave status.
I may be just thinking, flashing back to roots in the 70s, but weren't there white people who were also enslaved or at least treated as slaves?
At different times, there have been indentured servants, and depending on who you read or what country they're from, they were not necessarily treated well. But I would not say anything I read indicates the same level of ownership, non-personhood that slavery had. So now we've progressed to where slavery is based on race. So we've gone from slavery as a national thing to slavery based on religion to now slavery is based on race. So if you're black, you deserve to be enslaved. This idea carried over to the new colonies. Some of the colonies at the beginning were still uneasy about this idea. They felt like, I don't want to promote faith among my black people because if they become Christians, I will have to set them free. And I don't want to have to set them free. So some laws and bills began to be passed to ensure people that it's fine if you want to spread Christianity among your slaves. That, in fact, would be a good thing. In many cases you can read, they'll say there will be a better slave for you if they are a Christian, and you do not have to set them free if they become Christian. So this, in this area right in here, it's hard to read, but it says, it is enacted and declared by the Grand Assembly and the authority thereof, that the conferring of baptism doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. So if they're a slave, they can become a Christian, you can encourage it, but they will not become free. We also have a 1671 Maryland Act that reassured planters that a baptized enslaved person would still remain enslaved, and furthermore, their children would have to serve for life. So that's from 1671. So we can see that this concept of slavery based on race was fully in place by the time the 13 colonies had come together and we declared ourselves a country. So, George Whitfield, I don't know, some of you who had church history may have heard of George Whitfield. George Whitfield was perhaps our first celebrity evangelist. He was from the Church of England, but he began preaching and became just as popular in the colonies as he was in England. And he was an early advocate for slavery. He didn't start out at first advocating for slavery, but he never took a position against it. But in the colony of Georgia, when it first started, was trying to remain slave-free. And George Whitfield started an orphanage in Georgia. Well, the orphanage was not doing well financially, and he decided that part of the reason it wasn't doing well was because there were no slaves to run it. So if they had the extra help that they didn't have to pay, then that would make his orphanage financially successful. So at that point, he started openly advocating for slavery in the state of Georgia. So he wrote a letter, it's often been called the first formal defense of slavery in the Atlantic colonies by a minister to bring slavery to Georgia so that his orphanage would be successful. This was 25 years before issuing the Declaration of Independence, 36 years before the Constitution, and 41 years before Kentucky became a state, that we have a minister moving the country forward into slavery. So let's talk a little bit about culture. I talked in my first session, for those of you who were here, I talked about my own life. So what I was essentially doing was talking about culture. I was talking about stories that I had told, stories that we tell each other, stories that we hand down to our children, just those things that you begin to absorb that get into your bloodstream and your mind without you even knowing what you're learning and where it's coming from. This is a great book. I'd like to, if you ever want a book to read, it's called To Change the World by James Davison Hunter. And he talks a lot about the culture that we absorb. And he says it's so deeply embedded in our consciousness, in the habits of our lives, and in our social practices, that to question one's worldview is to question reality itself. Mm-hmm. So to question your own perspective is so embedded in you that it's a threat to your entire existence. It's a threat to your entire reality. And that's what I want us to think about, is all of this culture from Aristotle on up that's now come through, even through the church, and this is where we are as Kentucky is being founded. So what culture were those people living in? Or what waters were they swimming in? What white windshield, to go back to my first talk, what white windshield do they now have? Well, antebellum slave-holding Kentuckians swam in water of inherited pro-slavery Christian culture, of which most white people weren't even aware that they held. Which moves us into part 2, our next step along the road, where we're going to talk about the connection between evangelical thought and the slavery, the culture of the slavery in which they existed. We're going to talk about this more next week, but in the early 1800s, there was a big revival or series of revivals in Kentucky called the Cambridge Revivals. And it changed a lot of the ways that people thought about their faith. It certainly set the pattern for what faith in Kentucky would look like. So out of the Cambridge revivals, there came a rejection of sacraments. So the Church of England, right, those formal liturgical churches, we're not going with that anymore. Sacraments are out. We're focusing on individual faith. Our individual faith alone is all we need for salvation. It's our personal understanding of the Bible. It's one's own relationship with the Holy Spirit. The priorities of a Christian, two priorities: your own salvation and finding another person and converting them to their own salvation. I don't mean to suggest that any of those things are wrong, but I do mean to suggest it's very incomplete. But by focusing so much on the individual, they chose and failed to look at society, anything collective as a whole. What was not a priority coming out of this evangelical thought were social welfare of any groups of people, and certainly not anything to do with economic justice. So this was being said, at least in Kentucky, at the very early days. So this is by in the 1700s, moving up to the 1800s. So growing out of this deeply personal, this is all about me and my relationship with God, came three convictions that really changed or influenced the relationship of the white church with slavery. So the first was the conviction that white people in the United States stand in a providentially commissioned, a God-commissioned covenant relationship with God in the same way that Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus did. White people in this country had this same kind of relationship, covenant relationship that the patriarchs of the faith did. So this is the mindset that they're working from. And there was an article in one of a Jackson, pro-Jackson article that had this statement: the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent, allotted by providence, so given by God, for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. So this phrase, manifest destiny, took off. It spread like wildfire everywhere. That it is our manifest destiny as white people to take over this country and make it ours. This was one of the paintings that came out from that era that I know I saw this in my textbooks when I was a kid. I absolutely did. Of this American Progress. Her name was Columbia. Columbia is a personification of the United States. And you can see as Columbia is moving west that she's bringing light with her. She's bringing progress. She's bringing trains. She's got a school book in her hand. And she's driving out the darkness. And we see the native peoples being driven out with her because they belong to the darkness. This was the belief This is the personification of manifest destiny. That was the belief of the Kentuckians as they were setting up our state. And not just the Kentuckians, but that's who we're talking about today.
How many people have seen that before?
Yes. Well, I absolutely saw that in my textbooks. I'm not saying everybody did, I'm just,
The quote with the manifest destiny, who is that attributed to?
I would have to look up the author, but it was just in a magazine that was a pro-Jackson magazine.
From Jackson.
Yes,
Jackson.
Andrew Jackson.
Okay, yeah. I remember reading some history that Polk was the one who ran with it.
Right.
And really pushed it westward. But he was part of the
Yes, many people picked up on the phrase and ran with it, but that was the original quote from the magazine that started it all. Okay, before the influencers picked it up and ran with it. So the second big thought that took over was that absolute trust in the Bible alone, as divine revelation in the public sphere, so that nothing else could be or should be trusted to guide any decisions except the Bible. And we have pro-slavery minister Thornton Stringfellow, who we're going to talk about a lot in a minute, said, "It is to be hoped that on such a question as vital importance as slavery, we shall be seen cleaving to the Bible and taking all of our decisions about this matter from its inspired pages." That sounds good, doesn't it? Sounds good. Some of the corollary beliefs about the Bible at this time was that it promoted Republican political theory, it defined the glories of liberty, it opposed the tyrannies of religious authority, it forecast providential destiny for the United States, and that it was best interpreted by common people. Well, that sounds good. Because it's based on an assumption that the Bible is going to provide easy answers that are obvious and agreed upon by everyone. There was an abolitionist, Jared Smith, who said, "The religion taught by Jesus is so simple that the unlearned can both understand it and teach it." And then there was a holiness evangelist who said, "The Bible's a wonderfully simple book." So people are entering into it like, okay, the Bible's going to have all the answers, and it's so simple, so we all just need to read it and agree upon it, and things will be great. Well, the problem was people have different interpretations of what the Bible means. And by 1860, the interpretations of the Bible on slavery were splitting the country apart. Mark Knoll, who's a great historian of this era, wrote, "The Bible was not nearly as easy to interpret or as unifying as Christian people had thought." Which is going to move us into our next third section, looking at the pro-slavery defense of the Bible. This is Thornton Stringfellow, who I just mentioned, cheery-looking chap. He was not by any means the only very vocal pastor to speak on a pro-slavery defense of the Bible, but just the one that I used for my thesis. Comes out of Virginia. I couldn't find anyone specific to Kentucky, but with Kentucky's relationship to Virginia, I thought he would be good to look at. Stringfellow did not consider slavery a sin because he considered the Bible as both endorsing slavery and failing to condemn it. And he said, when there's no law to condemn something in human conduct, then there's no transgression. So we're going to be walking through very quickly some of the reasons why he believed that slavery was good and approved according to the Bible. This is a picture of his book that I used. I was reading from a reprint of this book, but I spent many, many, many hours reading the reprint of this book. So first we want to take a look at the curse of Noah, or sometimes called the curse of Canaan in Genesis. So it says, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." So according to Stringfellow, here you have it. So there's two things. This whole passage is very difficult to understand, and we're not going to get into that. But two things I want to point out is that there was a very strong belief that came out of this, that Canaan was the father of the people of Africa. That he was black or became black, but that he is now the father of all the African nations, the black people. And therefore, if he was made a slave, every black person after him is now a slave. And David will attest that this belief has lingered all through the ages, that black people are under the curse of Canaan and deserve to be slaves because of this. Now, some historians or theologians at the time didn't necessarily buy into the part about black people, but they still held to that this is where God is establishing slavery, establishing it and approving it. So this is a very significant passage when you're looking at the pro-slavery defense.
Nobody looked at the blindness as Noah awoke from his wine and realized that everything he said after that was wrong.
We're not going to argue with that. I'm just telling you why. But this, we could argue this for a long time. But the two things that came out of it were the belief that black people are associated with Canaan, therefore should be cursed as slaves, and regardless that God is establishing and approving slavery. Then we go to Abraham, and Stringfellow had a lot to say about Abraham. He says there's multiple lists that include male and female, servants and slaves, so distinguishing between the free state and the non-free state. That this Abraham had chattel slavery because he was able to bequeath slaves to his son Isaac, so he's able to pass them off as property. That slaves were property because Abraham could choose their religion by having them circumcised, having the men circumcised. And so he talks a lot about Abraham. Then in particular, he goes on to the story of Hagar. And so we have the story where Hagar is a slave. She's being mistreated by Sarah. She's pregnant. She leaves. And the angel comes to talk to Hagar, but he does not say, "You're right, Hagar, you shouldn't be a slave. Let me get you set up as a free woman." He sends Hagar back to Sarah. So Stringfellow says that God had the opportunity to oppose slavery, but he doesn't. He sends her back into slavery and does not condemn the system of slavery at all. Okay, so we have the patriarch Abraham, many, many slaves, chattel slavery, and now this specific case of sending Hagar back. I didn't make a slide for Job, but I just want to mention Stringfellow does talk about Job, but again, it's that idea that Job had some people who were apparently, depending on how you interpret it, free workers and some who were enslaved workers. So he makes a difference there. And then we get to Joseph. And Stringfellow writes that the conduct of Joseph in Egypt as Pharaoh's counselor under all circumstances proves him to be a friend to slavery. Because he says that he helps Pharaoh set up a system where Pharaoh would forever receive 1 out of 5 parts of what was produced. So he's setting up a system of entire dependence and hereditary bondage. That Joseph is helping Pharaoh set up a system of bondage that will go on forever into perpetuity. And Pharaoh benefits from that. Joseph benefits from that. God doesn't stop it. So God must be in favor. Okay? All right. Then we get to move on to Moses and the Mosaic Law. And basically, Stringfellow concludes that for 1,500 years, the prophets had a chance to stop slavery, and no one does. No one speaks out against the institution of slavery. And then we have this particular passage from Leviticus, again, where it looks like God's laying out the authority to people to purchase men and women as property, to hold them and their offspring forever in perpetuity, and to breed and sell slaves. Okay? And then Stringfellow goes on to say that from Abraham's day until the coming of Christ, slavery found favor with God. No marks of his displeasure are found resting on it. Therefore, it must be moral in nature. Then when we get to Jesus, interestingly enough, I thought it was interesting, Stringfellow doesn't spend a lot of time talking about Jesus. That's the point. Basically, he makes a couple of points and then he moves on. He says, no one claims that Jesus abolishes slavery because he doesn't. And then he says, it finds it strange that Jesus failed to prohibit it if he didn't like it. And he says that Jesus doesn't change any of Moses' code. He doesn't add anything to it. It's basically love God, love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't add anything new. Therefore, Moses must stand. And that's pretty much what he has to say about Jesus. Moving on. Then we get to all the Pauline letters. Again, he has a lot to say about Paul. We're not going to go over it all. But basically, that hereditary slavery existed everywhere they set up a new church. The churches didn't do anything to overthrow it. Must not be bad. He gives instructions that people should remain in the current state, like slaves. If you're a slave, be content wherever you are. Christians need to obey government. And then, of course, we get to Philemon, and he returns the slave Philemon. It comes to the case of Onesimus, the runaway slave, being returned to Philemon. And he just thinks that it's so self-evident that God approves of slavery that there's really nothing more that needs to be said about And when you question him, he actually wrote, "The institution of slavery is full of mercy." And he goes back to that idea that all of these people essentially would have burned in hell had it not been for some Christians coming and pulling them out and giving them the opportunity to be Christian. So that same thought that we saw back in the 1400s is now being taught in the 1800s in the United States. And this is a line drawing of a coffle gang from Kentucky. This is a line drawing of a coffle that was seen in Kentucky.
So happy that they're playing their instruments.
So happy, yes, they're just so happy, which takes us back to what we talked about last week about the myth, right? But I will say that there is a likelihood in some cases that they were forced to play and to appear to be happy, because there are certainly many records of that happening in different situations. So, this is just kind of a summary of some Stringfellow's points. And when you read them, I mean, I read all this stuff and I was like, dang, like you could easily end up believing that slavery is biblical when you only look at the verses that specifically mention slavery. If you only restrict what you read in the Bible to those verses, it would be easy to come to that conclusion. And when you only look at those verses, it creates a very simple, easy to understand argument. The anti-slavery side that we're not really going to delve into today, but it was much more complicated because it required thinking and nuance and history and interpretation, not nearly as simple, so not nearly as convincing if you're just speaking broadly to a general audience. Very easy to say, look, slavery, yes. When you have to broaden, it becomes a lot more complicated. We're going to get into that more in a different session. I will say I just found it so interesting. I read several things, several original documents where slaveholders were saying, this is what we're doing. We are loving our neighbor as ourselves. We are doing the godly thing by holding them slaves. So it doesn't do any good to use that argument when they are convinced that this is what they're already doing. And this is my last slide, and I just wanted to show this. This is a book written by Pastor Doug Wilson. You guys familiar with Doug Wilson? If you're not, you should be. He is a pastor out of Moscow, Idaho, that has basically an empire that has spread. There's 2 Facebook pages, if you follow Facebook, that are anti-Doug Wilson, rightfully so. There's a school in Spokane called the Oaks that is part of the Doug Wilson empire. This is a book that Doug Wilson wrote, published by his own publishing house, in which he basically, everything I just told you that Stringfellow said, he repeats in this book. Pro-slavery, pro-Bible defense slavery. Slavery would be approved by God, is his position. So my point in bringing this up, a couple points, is that history is never gone. History is never over. History is still today. The thoughts that happened in the 1400s were still happening in the 1700s, and the 1800s, and the 1960s, and they are just the same thoughts, it's the same lies that we are facing today on a daily basis. So it's very important to know the history so that we can recognize it when it shows up again. And hopefully we can learn from people who went before us, who stood against the lies and stood against the injustices. Because we are those people today. We are those people. Someday, God willing, there will be people who look back on this era and say, oh, look, it showed up again. But there were people who stood up against it. That's us. Thank you. I get a little bit longer every week, and there's a little bit less time for conversation, but we still do have a few minutes if anybody has something they want to
Would
ask
you
or
go
say.
back to the previous slide? There was something at the bottom that, yeah, I thought that was an interesting point.
Oh, yes. There were people, Jace is talking about the last point here, there were people who were saying, yes, slavery was okay by God, but it was not the same kind of slavery that was practiced in the United States. So there were people who were saying, we're not ready to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater, but there are some significant things that need to be changed, because when you go to the Old Testament and you look at the kind of slavery and all the restrictions that God put on it, it would not be the chattel slavery that we have practiced here. That argument didn't fly a lot, but it is important to know that people were making it. Good point.
Yeah, and it was the same church, the same Christian church, that both comes up with arguments to defend slavery. And it's also the Christian church that begins the efforts to abolish slavery. So you have, even though we want to think, oh, our Christian church could have been this wrong, it was also right. And the arguments, but what took place from a historical standpoint is that slavery was authorized by America at its beginning. It wasn't addressed successfully in our Constitution. So the norm was slavery in our country. And it's the abolitionist Christians who began the effort to counter that. And so and this is the case on everything in history, in relationship to Christianity. There are people on one side using Christianity to defend certain things. There are Christians on the other side seeking to change. And the same arguments that were in your presentation for the defense of slavery were also the same arguments used to defend women not having the vote, to defend them not being equal to white males. So it can be used for all sorts of things. And it's up to individual Christians to determine which is the position that most aligns with what we understand Jesus to have been about. And there'll be something else coming down the road. It won't be Christianity, but there'll be something in which the church will divide again over it. It's just inevitable.
Just do that. Thank you. David?
Yeah, I want to speak. I want to get away from the microphone a bit. I want to speak from my own personal history. I felt called to ministry. You can hear me. I felt called to ministry at a very early age. And in the Southern Baptist churches, some of what you saw highlighted here was that ignorance was bliss in the conservative church. Well, folks, it still is. I started out preaching, imitating the pastors that I had heard all my life. And I was told that I was good at it. But I was essentially parroting what I had heard. When I got into college, I minored in philosophy, and I had to confront a lot of things in my own journey that just wasn't making sense. And so my route from Southern Baptist to Methodism began a long time ago. I had a blood uncle, married my mother's sister, who did the argument, after I was a pastor, argued with me about Noah's son, and that
there's a curse on black people and they were meant to be slaves. Well, that came crashing down. But what I want to point out is that I was ordained at 19, without seminary, without much formal training, and there is still a premium on preachers who are ignorant. And you hear Christian artists who've made money from selling their music, now starting churches and becoming pastors and selling books, without any kind of confrontation and critical thinking that might reshape some of their values. And so if we're wondering how the current culture still embraces so much of these ideas, I can tell you from my own life, it was really easy. And it's still out there.
Thank you. And that is going to be, remember what both Marty and Dave said next week, because it's going to tie in. Next week, we're going to be looking at the Methodist, the Baptist, and the Presbyterians, and how those churches responded to or failed to respond to the question of, is slavery a sin? And we're only, of course, going to be looking at it from the southern point of view, because that's where Kentucky was. But it's really important to pay attention to how all of this thought developed, and it just kept being handed down in the culture from generation to generation, and it hasn't stopped yet. We have a couple more minutes. Anybody want to ask?
Yeah, I just one comment. You go back in time, and it wasn't a white-black conflict, it was shades of color. In fact, the people of no color, white, didn't exist back in some of those times. And so you had the Arab culture, African cultures. And so, I think there's a complexity there that we don't readily appreciate today unless we do study it. And then you have the geopolitics of Africa, Mediterranean, the Arabs. And we don't have that so much in this country. But I've pondered that as I read about this issue.
Very true. And I think to say that we're using Kentucky as a microcosm, you can look at any place, any point in history, at the conflicts there, and see many of the similar things. They're not exactly the same, but they are similar. We just happen to be looking at this one because this is the one that affects us the most.